Billionaire's wife left him. Then a maid's little daughter gave him a rose and changed his life. Alexander Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the first snow of December dust the Manhattan skyline. At 34, he had everything money could buy: a technology empire worth billions, properties across 3 continents, and a name that made Wall Street traders straighten their ties. Yet the reflection staring back at him was that of a stranger. Sharp jawlines set in perpetual displeasure, steel-gray eyes that hadn't softened in years, and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. 6 months had passed since Victoria had walked out. His wife of 3 years had left a note on Italian stationery, her perfect handwriting explaining that she couldn't live with a man who had replaced his heart with stock portfolios. She'd taken her designer luggage, her jewelry, gifts he'd selected through his assistant, and left behind only silence. Alexander had read the note once, filed it away, and returned to work. Emotions were inefficient. Love was a liability. He'd learned that lesson from his father, a man who'd built an empire on cold calculation and died alone in a hospital room Alexander had been too busy to visit. The Sterling mansion in the Hamptons sat empty most of the year now, a monument to a marriage that had been more merger than union. But his primary residence, a sprawling townhouse in the Upper East Side, required maintenance. Alexander cycled through housekeeping services with the same frequency he changed business strategies. They were all the same, people who moved through his home like ghosts, there one day and gone the next when he found some microscopic flaw in their work. Mrs. Patterson, his estate manager, had called that morning with another proposition. "Mr. Sterling, I've found someone exceptional. Elena Morales. She's been working for the Hastings family for 2 years. Impeccable references. She's willing to accommodate your particular standards." "Fine," Alexander had said, barely listening as he signed a contract worth $40 million. "Have her start Monday." Monday arrived with freezing rain pelting the windows. Alexander was in his home office, 3 monitors displaying real-time market data from Tokyo, London, and New York. He'd been awake since 4, mainlining espresso and restructuring a corporate acquisition that would put 500 people out of work. Necessary casualties. Business wasn't personal. He heard the soft click of the front door around 7:30. The new maid, presumably. He didn't bother looking up. Mrs. Patterson would handle the orientation. His concentration didn't break until nearly 9, when he emerged from his office in search of his 4th coffee of the day. The house was transformed. Not just clean, but alive somehow. The marble floors gleamed, without that chemical smell he associated with cleaning products. Fresh flowers, simple white lilies, stood in the entryway, their fragrance subtle and calming. The morning newspapers were arranged precisely on the dining table beside a silver coffee service that was already prepared, still steaming. A woman stood in the kitchen, her back to him. She wore simple black pants and a white blouse, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun. She moved with quiet efficiency, putting away dishes from what must have been her own breakfast preparation. "You're early," Alexander said, his voice cold out of habit. The woman turned, and he found himself looking into eyes that were both wary and warm, an unusual combination. She was pretty in an understated way, with high cheekbones and full lips that curved into a polite, professional smile. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling. I'm Elena Morales. Mrs. Patterson said you prefer the house attended to before you begin your day." Her voice was soft but steady, with just a trace of an accent that suggested English might be her second language. "Coffee's acceptable," Alexander said, which was the closest he came to praise. He poured himself a cup. "I have specific requirements. I assume Mrs. Patterson provided the manual?" "Yes, sir. 68 pages. If Elena was intimidated, she didn't show it. I've memorized it." Alexander raised an eyebrow. Most of the staff complained about his detailed instructions. "We'll see." He was about to return to his office when he heard it, a small sound, something between a cough and a whimper, coming from the direction of the service entrance. His jaw tightened. What was that? Elena's professional composure cracked for just a moment, worry flashing across her face. "Mr. Sterling, I apologize. My daughter. She's not feeling well, and my usual sitter fell through this morning. I had no one to. You brought a child into my home? Alexander's voice dropped to that dangerous quiet that made executives sweat. Without permission? Sir, I understand this is irregular, but… Irregular? He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. It's unacceptable. I don't allow. Another sound interrupted him, this time unmistakably a child's cough. Before Elena could move, Alexander strode toward the service entrance. In a small alcove near the back door, surrounded by carefully arranged pillows and blankets, sat a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Dark curls framed a small face flushed with fever, and enormous brown eyes looked up at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She clutched a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest, and despite her obvious illness, she sat perfectly still, as if trying to make herself invisible. "Mama," the child whispered, her voice hoarse. Elena rushed past Alexander, kneeling beside her daughter. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay." She placed a hand on the child's forehead and winced. "You're burning up." Alexander should have fired her on the spot. Should have called Mrs. Patterson and had them both escorted out. Instead, he found himself studying the child's face. There was something in her eyes, a depth of understanding that seemed impossible for someone so young. She wasn't crying, wasn't throwing a tantrum, just sitting there, sick and scared, trying to be good. "What's her name?" The question escaped before Alexander could stop it. Elena looked up, surprised. "Sophie. Her name is Sophie." The little girl coughed again, and Elena gathered her close. "Mr. Sterling, I'll leave immediately. I just need to call a cab." "In this weather?" Alexander gestured toward the windows, where freezing rain was now coming down in sheets. "With a sick child?" He pulled out his phone and dialed. "Dr. Reeves? Alexander Sterling. I need you at my townhouse immediately. A child, approximately 3 years old, high fever." He paused, looking at Elena questioningly. "Cough, mild rash, refusing food since yesterday," Elena provided quietly, tears gathering in her eyes. Alexander relayed the information. 20 minutes? Good. He ended the call and looked down at Elena. "My personal physician. He'll be here shortly." "Mr. Sterling, I can't possibly." "The spare bedroom on the 2nd floor. Take her there. It's warm, and there's an attached bathroom." Alexander's tone left no room for argument. "I'll have Mrs. Chun prepare some broth. Does she have any allergies?" Elena shook her head, clearly overwhelmed. "No, but sir, your rules are my rules to break." Alexander turned away, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her eyes. "Just keep her quiet." As Elena carried Sophie up the stairs, Alexander stood in his pristine kitchen, wondering what he'd just done. The child had looked at him for perhaps 5 seconds, and somehow his carefully ordered world had shifted on its axis. He told himself it was simple pragmatism. He couldn't have a sick child in a taxi during a storm, but deep down, he knew it was something else. It was those eyes. Sophie's eyes, looking up at him with that strange mixture of fear and hope, had stirred something he'd thought long dead. And Alexander Sterling, who prided himself on emotional detachment, felt the first crack form in the ice around his heart. Dr. Reeves arrived exactly 20 minutes later, his silver hair damp from the rain. Alexander led him upstairs to the guest room, where Elena sat on the edge of the bed, holding Sophie's small hand. The child had fallen into a fitful sleep, her breathing shallow and uneven. "Viral infection," Dr. Reeves announced after a thorough examination. "Nothing serious, but she'll need rest, fluids, and monitoring for the next 48 hours. The fever should break by tomorrow evening if we manage it properly." He wrote out prescriptions and handed them to Alexander. "Keep her hydrated. Lukewarm baths if the fever spikes above 102. Call me if there's any change." After the doctor left, Alexander found himself in unfamiliar territory. Elena sat vigil by Sophie's bedside, refusing to leave even to eat. Around noon, Alexander had Mrs. Chun, his cook, prepare a tray, soup, bread, tea, and carried it upstairs himself. "You need to eat," he said, setting the tray on the dresser. You can't care for her if you collapse. Elena looked up, exhausted. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. For everything. I know this is an imposition. Eat, he repeated, more gently than he intended. Then, surprising himself again, he added, I'll sit with her while you shower. There's a bathroom down the hall with fresh towels. I couldn't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. He settled into the chair she'd vacated. 15 minutes. She'll be fine. Elena hesitated, looking between her sleeping daughter and this strange, cold man who was showing unexpected kindness. Finally, she nodded and slipped out of the room. Alexander sat in the quiet, watching Sophie sleep. She was so small, so fragile. Her stuffed rabbit had fallen to the floor, and he picked it up, noting the careful repairs, an ear stitched back on, the worn fabric loved nearly bare. This toy had been cherished, protected. Sophie stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, confusion clouded her features, then fear. Mama? Your mother is just down the hall, Alexander said, his voice automatically softening. She'll be right back. The little girl studied him with those impossibly deep eyes. Are you the prince? Alexander blinked. What? Mama reads me stories. About princes in big castles. Sophie's voice was hoarse, but curious. You live in a castle. Despite himself, Alexander felt his lips twitch. This is a townhouse, not a castle. It's big like a castle. Sophie coughed, and Alexander quickly poured water from the pitcher Elena had left, helping the child take small sips. Mama says big houses are for people with big hearts. Is your heart big? The question, asked with such innocent directness, hit Alexander like a physical blow. I don't know, he found himself admitting. Oh. Sophie seemed to consider this. That's sad. Why is it sad? 'Cause everyone should know if they have a big heart or not. She clutched her rabbit tighter. Mama has the biggest heart in the whole world. She says love makes it grow. Alexander was saved from responding by Elena's return. She rushed to the bedside, relief flooding her features when she saw Sophie awake. Hey, baby. How are you feeling? The prince gave me water, Sophie announced. But he doesn't know if his heart is big. Elena's eyes met Alexander's over her daughter's head, a question in them. He stood abruptly. I have calls to make. The pharmacy delivery should arrive within the hour. Mrs. Chin will bring dinner at 6. He escaped to his office, but concentration eluded him. Sophie's question echoed in his mind. A child's observation, yet it had cut to the core of something he'd been avoiding for years. The next morning, Alexander found himself checking on the guest room before his usual 5 a.m. workout. Sophie's fever had dropped slightly, and both she and Elena were sleeping, Elena curled uncomfortably in the chair. Without thinking, Alexander retrieved a blanket from the linen closet and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't wake. This pattern continued for 3 days. Alexander would tell himself he was simply being a responsible employer, ensuring his staff member could return to work soon. But truthfully, he found himself drawn to that upstairs room. Sophie, even sick, had an energy about her, a curiosity and warmth that filled spaces Alexander hadn't known were empty. On the 3rd evening, Sophie's fever finally broke. Alexander was in his study when he heard laughter, real, genuine laughter, echoing down the hallway. He followed the sound to find Elena and Sophie playing a simple card game on the guest room floor. Mr. Sterling. Sophie's face lit up when she saw him. I'm better. Mama says maybe tomorrow I can go home. Something twisted in Alexander's chest. That's good. Do you want to play Go Fish with us? Sophie held up a handful of cards. I'm really good. I've won 3 times. I don't. Alexander started to refuse, but those eyes stopped him. 1 game. He sat on the floor, something he hadn't done in perhaps 20 years, and accepted the cards Sophie dealt with intense concentration. She was a terrible player, showing her cards to anyone who looked, giggling when she forgot the rules. But her joy was infectious. Got any 3s? She asked Alexander, beaming. Go fish. Sophie drew a card and squealed. I got a 3 anyway. That's lucky. That's very lucky, Elena agreed, smiling at her daughter with such pure love that Alexander had to look away. They played for an hour. Alexander couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed, but he found himself chuckling at Sophie's antics, at her elaborate stories about why she needed certain cards. The 7 wants to be with the other 7 cause they're best friends. When Sophie's eyes grew heavy, Elena scooped her up. Bedtime, sweetheart. Will the prince read me a story? Sophie asked, half asleep already. Alexander froze. I don't. Please. Sophie's eyes opened, looking directly at him. You have a nice voice. Not so cold anymore. Elena started to apologize, but Alexander found himself nodding. One story. He read from a battered picture book about a lonely dragon who learned to make friends. His voice, so accustomed to barking orders and closing deals, gentled as Sophie's breathing evened out. When he finished, she was asleep, a small smile on her face. Thank you, Elena whispered as they stepped into the hallway. You've been incredibly kind. I know this isn't what you signed up for. No, Alexander agreed. It isn't. They stood in the dim hallway, and for the first time in months, Alexander felt something other than the cold numbness he'd wrapped around himself like armor. Elena, he said quietly, tell me about her. About Sophie. And there, in the hallway of his too large, too empty house, Elena told him. About Sophie's father, who disappeared before she was born. About working 3 jobs to afford their tiny apartment in Queens. About Sophie's fierce intelligence, her tendency to befriend every stray cat in the neighborhood, her absolute conviction that every person had goodness inside them if you just looked hard enough. She believes in magic, Elena said softly. In fairy tales and happy endings. I try to prepare her for reality, but she sees the world differently. She sees the best in everything. Even in me? The question escaped before Alexander could stop it. Elena met his eyes. Especially in you, Mr. Sterling. From the first moment she saw you, she called you the prince. I told her you were just my employer, but she insisted. She said you had sad eyes, and all sad princes just need someone to remind them how to smile. Alexander turned away, throat tight. She's 3 years old. Yes. And somehow, she's wiser than most adults I know. Elena hesitated. We'll be out of your way tomorrow. I've arranged for a friend to watch her while I work. I can return to my regular schedule. No. Elena blinked. Sir? Alexander faced her again, a decision crystallizing. Bring her with you. There are 6 bedrooms in this house that are never used. Sophie can stay in this one. You can work, she can play or read or whatever 3-year-olds do. I'm barely here anyway. Mr. Sterling, I couldn't possibly. You can. You will. He softened his tone. Please. The house could use the sound of laughter. Tears gathered in Elena's eyes. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. But as Alexander returned to his study, he thought maybe he did. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his house didn't feel like a mausoleum. It felt almost like a home. And it terrified him. Alexander Sterling had built his empire on routine and control. Every morning began the same way. Wake at 4:30 a.m., work out for 90 minutes, shower, review overnight market reports, breakfast at 7 o'clock sharp. His life was a precisely calibrated machine, each gear turning in perfect synchronization. Then Sophie happened. The first morning she was officially part of the household routine. Alexander was on his treadmill at 5:45 a.m. when he heard it, the patter of small feet in the hallway outside his home gym. He slowed the machine, listening. The footsteps stopped outside his door. I know you're there, he called out, not unkindly. The door cracked open, and Sophie's face appeared, her dark curls wild from sleep. She wore pajamas decorated with cartoon stars and clutched her worn rabbit. I heard noise, she whispered. Are you fighting a monster? Alexander looked down at the treadmill, then back at her serious expression. No. I'm running. For exercise. Oh. Sophie padded into the room, completely unafraid. Can I watch? Shouldn't you be asleep? I'm an early bird. Mama says early birds get the worms, but I don't like worms. She climbed onto a weight bench, settling her rabbit on her lap. Do you like worms? And just like that, Alexander Sterling found himself having a conversation about worms at 6 in the morning with a 3-year-old. It should have been annoying. Somehow, it wasn't. This became their pattern. Every morning, Sophie would appear, asking questions about everything. Why did he run if nobody was chasing him? What were the numbers on his computer screen? Did he ever get tired of being grown up? Alexander answered with far more patience than he'd ever shown his executives, finding that her curiosity was refreshingly honest, untainted by agenda or manipulation. Elena tried to apologize, to keep Sophie from bothering him, but Alexander waved her off. She's fine, he said, and meant it. The changes started small. Mrs. Chin began preparing food Sophie liked: mac and cheese, chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs. The pristine white living room acquired a corner dedicated to toys and books. Alexander's precisely scheduled days developed unexpected interruptions. Mr. Sterling? Sophie appeared in his office doorway one afternoon, holding a crayon drawing. I made you something. Alexander, in the middle of a conference call with Tokyo, should have sent her away. Instead, he muted his mic. What is it? It's you. She presented the drawing proudly, a stick figure with gray eyes and a smile. See? You're smiling 'cause you're not sad anymore. Alexander stared at the drawing, something warm unfurling in his chest. It's thank you, Sophie. You can put it on your wall. That's where important art goes. After she skipped away, Alexander unmuted his call. Gentlemen, I need to reschedule. Something important has come up. He hung up before they could respond and carefully pinned Sophie's drawing to the wall behind his desk, where he could see it while he worked. His business associates began to notice changes. Alexander, notorious for his cutthroat tactics, started asking about his employees' families. He approved a company-wide parental leave policy that his board called financially irresponsible. When a competitor tried to poach one of his best engineers, Alexander didn't just counteroffer. He asked what the engineer needed to be happy and adjusted the entire department's structure to provide it. You're going soft, Sterling, his CFO remarked during a board meeting. Alexander thought of Sophie's drawing, of her absolute certainty that he had a big heart somewhere inside. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I'm finally getting smart. One Saturday afternoon, Alexander found Sophie in the library, surrounded by books that were far too advanced for her. She was reading to her stuffed rabbit, making up elaborate stories based on the pictures. And then the princess told the dragon that he wasn't scary, just lonely, so they became best friends and ate cookies together, Sophie narrated solemnly. That's not what the book says, Alexander observed, settling into a nearby chair. Sophie looked up, unbothered. I know, but my story's better. Books should have happy endings. Life doesn't always have happy endings. Why not? It was such a simple question, asked with such genuine confusion, that Alexander didn't have an answer. Why not, indeed? Who had decided that growing up meant growing cold, that success required sacrifice of joy? Sophie, he asked slowly, why do you call me the prince? She tilted her head, considering. In all the best stories, the prince is alone at the beginning. He lives in a big castle and has lots of treasure, but he's not happy. Then something magic happens, a fairy godmother, or a spell, or true love's kiss, and he remembers how to smile. You are alone in your big castle, so you must be the prince. And what happens to the prince in your story? Sophie's face lit up. He finds his family. Not the family he was born with, but the family his heart was born to love. And they all live happily ever after in the castle, but it's not cold anymore 'cause love makes everything warm. Alexander's throat tightened. That's a good story. It's your story, Sophie said matter-of-factly. I can feel it. That evening, Alexander did something unprecedented. He left work at 5 o'clock. He came home to find Elena cooking dinner, something that smelled amazing and nothing like the bland, healthy meals Mrs. Chin usually prepared. Mama's making her special pasta, Sophie announced, setting the table with intense concentration. "And I'm helping. You are?" Alexander watched her arrange napkins with elaborate care. "Uh-huh. 3 plates. 'Cause we're a family now. Right, Mama?" Elena's hands stilled over the pot. "Sophie, sweetie, Mr. Sterling is our employer, not." "Do you like pasta, Mr. Sterling?" Sophie interrupted, looking up at him with those impossibly hopeful eyes. Alexander looked at the table set for 3, at the homey chaos of the kitchen, at Elena's worried expression. He could shut this down, return to his office, maintain professional boundaries, keep the walls up. Or he could stay. "I love pasta," he heard himself say. "And Sophie? When it's just us, you can call me Alex." Sophie's smile could have powered the entire city. "Okay, Alex. Come sit by me." Dinner was chaotic and perfect. Sophie talked nonstop, asking Alexander questions about everything from his favorite color — he didn't have one or thought he didn't, until Sophie insisted everyone must have one, and he found himself saying blue, like the ocean. Elena shared stories about her childhood in Costa Rica, about her grandmother who taught her to cook, about the small joys that had sustained her through hard times. Alexander, who usually dined alone while reviewing reports, found himself laughing at Sophie's knock-knock jokes, learning about Elena's dreams of someday opening a small restaurant, experiencing something he'd forgotten existed: connection. After dinner, Sophie insisted on showing Alexander her bedtime routine. "First we read 2 stories, then we say what we're grateful for, then Mama sings the goodnight song." "I couldn't intrude on," Alexander started. "Please." Sophie grabbed his hand. Her small fingers wrapped around 2 of his, warm and trusting. "You're part of the family now. Family does bedtime together." So Alexander found himself sitting on the edge of Sophie's bed, listening to Elena read about wild things and places where the wild things are. He watched Sophie's eyes grow heavy, heard her mumble her gratitudes. "I'm grateful for Mama and Alex and Mr. Rabbit and Mac and Cheese and—" Elena sang softly, a Spanish lullaby that wrapped around them like a blanket. Sophie's breathing evened out, but her hand still clutched Alexander's finger. "She won't let go until she's fully asleep," Elena whispered. "You don't have to." "It's fine," Alexander said quietly. And it was. Sitting in the soft lamplight, holding this child's hand while she dreamed, was the most peaceful moment he'd experienced in years. When Sophie finally released his hand, Alexander stood carefully. In the hallway, Elena touched his arm. "Thank you," she said. "For everything. For letting her into your life. I know you didn't have to." "Elena." Alexander turned to face her. "I've spent years believing that caring about people was weakness. That love was a liability. Sophie is teaching me something different. You both are." "What's that?" "That maybe the strongest thing a person can do is let someone matter." Elena's eyes shimmered. "She matters to you?" Alexander thought of Sophie's drawings on his office wall, of her laughter echoing through halls that had been silent too long, of the way his heart had started beating again after years of just pumping blood. "Yes," he said simply. "You both do." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to explore. But something had shifted, irrevocably. The walls Alexander had built so carefully were crumbling, one crayon drawing, one shared dinner, one small hand at a time. And for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling wasn't afraid of what that meant. The first signs of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Sophie and Elena had become permanent fixtures in Alexander's life. He was reviewing quarterly reports when his phone buzzed with a message from his estate manager, Mrs. Patterson. "Mr. Sterling, we need to discuss your current domestic arrangement. Several board members have expressed concerns." Alexander's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting this. His transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. Where he'd once been the ruthless corporate shark who'd built Sterling Technologies through calculated acquisitions and strategic demolitions of competitors, he was now the CEO who'd implemented family-friendly policies and turned down a hostile takeover that would have netted him $500 million because it would have devastated a community. The emergency board meeting was called for Thursday. Alexander spent 2 days preparing, knowing this was about more than business decisions. This was about who he was becoming and whether the people who'd profited from his coldness would allow the change. Wednesday evening, Sophie sensed something was wrong. She appeared in his study carrying her rabbit and a picture book. "You look sad again," she announced, climbing into his lap uninvited. "Your eyes are cold like they used to be." Alexander set down his pen. "I have some difficult meetings tomorrow, Princess." Sophie had insisted on being called Princess if he was Prince, and Alexander had surrendered after approximately 30 seconds of her pleading eyes. "What kind of difficult?" "The kind where people might tell me I'm making mistakes." Sophie considered this gravely. "Are you?" "I don't think so. But some very important people disagree." "Why?" "Because I used to be one way, and now I'm different. Change makes people uncomfortable." Sophie patted his cheek with her small hand. "Mama says change is how butterflies happen. Caterpillars get all cozy in their cocoons and people think they're gone, but they're just becoming something beautiful. Maybe you're a butterfly, Alex." Despite his stress, Alexander smiled. "Maybe." "Don't let the mean people make you go back in your cocoon," Sophie said seriously. "Butterflies are supposed to fly." The board meeting was brutal. 12 men and 3 women sat around the mahogany table, their expressions ranging from concerned to hostile. Richard Blackwood, the largest shareholder after Alexander, led the charge. "Your recent decisions have cost this company over $200 million in potential revenue," Richard began, his voice cold. "The parental leave policy, the declined merger, the restructuring of our acquisition strategy, these emotional decisions are destroying shareholder value." "Our stock price is up 18% this quarter," Alexander countered. "That's momentum from your previous strategy. This softer approach will catch up with us." Richard leaned forward. "And let's address the elephant in the room, your live-in maid and her child. The optics are terrible, Alexander. People are talking." "Let them talk. She's clearly taking advantage of you," Margaret Chen, the CFO, added. "A woman in her position, a single mother, targeting a vulnerable, wealthy man. Careful." Alexander's voice dropped to that dangerous quiet. "Elena has shown more integrity than anyone in this room. She works harder than any of you and asks for nothing beyond fair compensation." "Fair compensation?" Richard scoffed. "You're housing her, feeding her child, providing private medical care. You've become emotionally compromised." "I've become human," Alexander shot back. "Something I'd forgotten how to be." "This is exactly what we're talking about," another board member interjected. "The Alexander Sterling we knew wouldn't waste time on sentimentality. He built this company on rational decisions, not feelings. And those rational decisions left me divorced, alone, and miserable in a house full of things I didn't care about." Alexander stood, planting his hands on the table. "Yes, I've changed. I've remembered that companies are made of people, not just profit margins. That loyalty matters more than quarterly earnings. That a child's laughter has value that doesn't show up on a balance sheet." "How touching," Richard said dryly. "But this is a business, not a charity. And that woman has clearly manipulated her way into your life. How long before she's asking for marriage? For a share of your fortune? That's enough." Alexander's voice cracked like a whip. "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, you're being played. A pretty young woman, a sick child needing a hero, it's textbook manipulation." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because Alexander believed them, but because they echoed his own early suspicions, the defensive thoughts that had crossed his mind before he'd really known Elena and Sophie. The meeting ended with an ultimatum: return to his previous management style and resolve his domestic situation, or face a vote of no confidence. Alexander drove home in silence, Richard's accusations echoing in his mind. He knew they weren't true. He'd seen Elena's integrity, her fierce independence, the way she'd tried to refuse his help at every turn. But doubt was insidious, creeping in through cracks he thought he'd sealed. He arrived home to find Sophie waiting by the front window, as she did every evening now. Her face lit up when his car pulled into the drive. "Alex. Alex. Look what I drew." She ran to him with a picture of 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. It's our family. Family. The word that Richard had weaponized, that Margaret had sneered at, suddenly felt fragile in his hands. It's beautiful, princess, he said, but his voice was hollow. Sophie's smile faltered. You're sad. Did the mean people make you sad? Sweetheart, why don't you go help Mama with dinner? Alexander suggested, unable to meet those two perceptive eyes. That evening, Alexander was distant. He picked at his dinner, barely responded to Sophie's chatter, retreated to his study immediately after. Through the closed door, he heard Elena putting Sophie to bed, heard the questions. Why is Alex sad, Mama? Did I do something wrong?
No, baby.
Sometimes grown-ups have grown-up problems. But I thought we made him happy. I thought we were his family. Oh, sweetheart. Alexander pressed his palms against his eyes. What was he doing? These weren't his family. Elena was his employee. Sophie was his employee's daughter. The board was right. He'd let sentiment cloud his judgment, built a fantasy that could never be real. The next morning, Alexander couldn't bring himself to meet Sophie for their usual early morning routine. He left for the office at 5, before she woke up. When he returned that evening, he went straight to his study. The pattern continued for 3 days. Sophie tried everything. She left drawings under his door. She waited by the window for hours. She asked Elena repeatedly what she'd done wrong. You haven't done anything wrong, Elena assured her, holding her daughter close. But her own eyes were bright with unshed tears. On the 4th day, Elena found Alexander in his study late at night, surrounded by paperwork and empty coffee cups. We'll leave, she said quietly from the doorway. Alexander's head snapped up. What? Sophie and I. We'll leave. I've found another position, and my friend can watch Sophie during the day. We'll be gone by the weekend. Elena's voice was steady, but he could see the pain in her eyes. Whatever happened at that meeting, whatever those people said about us, you clearly need space. I won't let Sophie keep getting hurt watching you pull away. Elena. She thinks she did something wrong, Alexander. She cries herself to sleep wondering why you don't want to see her anymore. She's 3 years old, and she doesn't understand why the prince in her fairy tale suddenly disappeared. Guilt crashed over Alexander. I never meant. I know what they probably said. Elena continued, her voice harder now. That I'm after your money. That this is some scheme. That a woman like me couldn't possibly care about a man like you, for any reason other than what you can provide. She laughed bitterly. They don't know that I fought this. That I tried so hard to keep professional boundaries. That falling for you was the last thing I wanted because I knew it would end like this. Alexander stood. You what? Tears finally spilled down Elena's cheeks. You think I wanted to love you? You were supposed to just be my employer. But then you stayed with Sophie when she was sick. You learned her favorite foods. You let her call you Alex. You started smiling again, and it was like watching the sun come out after winter. She wiped her eyes angrily. I fell in love with who you were becoming. With the man who reads bedtime stories and asks about my dreams and makes my daughter believe in magic. Elena. But I won't watch you go back into that cocoon. I won't let Sophie's heart break more than it already has. So we'll leave. You can return to your board's expectations, and we'll all move on. She turned to go, but Alexander caught her hand. I was scared, he said quietly. They told me I was being manipulated, that this wasn't real. And for a moment, I believed them, because it seemed impossible that someone like you could care about someone like me without an agenda. That's your answer? Elena tried to pull away. You believe them? For a moment, Alexander admitted. One terrible moment where my old instincts kicked in and I couldn't see past the walls I'd built. But then I came home and Sophie was waiting at the window like she always does, and I realized something. What? That I've spent my whole life protecting myself from being hurt by refusing to care about anything. And maybe some people will take advantage of that. Maybe letting people in is a risk. But Sophie was right. I was just a caterpillar hiding in a cocoon, cold and safe and dying inside. He took both of Elena's hands. You and Sophie didn't manipulate me. You saved me. You reminded me that being human isn't a weakness. It's the whole point. Alexander. Elena's voice broke. I love you, he said simply. I love your strength and your kindness, and the way you see the best in people. I love how you fought for Sophie every day of her life. I love the way you sing Spanish lullabies and make pasta that tastes like home. And I love that you called me out when I was being a coward. Elena sobbed once. We can't just. I know. This is complicated. There's the board and public perception, and 1,000 reasons why this is a terrible idea. Alexander pulled her closer. But I've spent my whole life making sensible decisions, and they left me empty. Maybe it's time I made the crazy choice. The one that actually matters. A small voice interrupted from the doorway. Does this mean you're not sad anymore? They both turned to find Sophie in her pajamas, clutching Mr. Rabbit, her eyes wide and hopeful. Alexander released Elena's hands and knelt down, opening his arms. Sophie ran to him, and he held her tight. I'm so sorry, Princess, he whispered into her hair. I got scared and forgot how to be brave. Can you forgive me? Sophie pulled back to look at him seriously. Did you forget you're the prince?
Yes.
I did. And that were your family? Alexander's throat tightened. I was afraid I wasn't good enough to be your family. Sophie cupped his face with her small hands, exactly like she'd done that first day. Silly Alex. You don't have to be good enough. You just have to love us. That's how families work. Then yes, Alexander said, looking up at Elena, at this woman who'd cracked his frozen heart wide open. We're family, if you'll have me. Elena joined them on the floor, wrapping her arms around them both. We'll have you. Cold days, warm days, and everything in between. Sophie giggled, squirming between them.
See?
I told you it would have a happy ending. All the best stories do. And in that moment, surrounded by the two people who taught him that love wasn't a liability but a lifeline, Alexander Sterling finally understood. The greatest risk wasn't opening his heart. It was never opening it at all. The next morning, Alexander woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He'd spent the night with Elena and Sophie asleep in the guest room. He on the floor, Elena in the chair, Sophie tucked safely in bed, because none of them could bear to be apart. Now, watching the sunrise paint the room in shades of gold, he knew what he had to do. He kissed Sophie's forehead gently, touched Elena's hand. I have some things to handle, he whispered. Trust me? Elena's eyes, still heavy with sleep, met his. Always. The emergency board meeting Alexander called for that afternoon had his executives scrambling. When he walked into the conference room at precisely 2 o'clock, he carried a folder and an expression of absolute certainty. Gentlemen, ladies, he began without preamble. I've made some decisions. Richard Blackwood leaned back in his chair, smug. Come to your senses, have we? In a manner of speaking. Alexander opened his folder. First, I'm implementing a new company philosophy. Sterling Technologies will prioritize employee well-being alongside profitability. Our metrics will include worker satisfaction, community impact, and sustainable growth, not just quarterly earnings. The room erupted. That's financial suicide. Our shareholders will revolt. You can't be serious. Alexander raised his hand, and silence fell. Second, I'm donating $500 million from my personal fortune to establish a foundation for single parents. It will provide childcare, education assistance, and career development. Elena Morales will serve as the executive director, if she accepts. Margaret Chin gasped. You're giving away $500 million to your maid? To a foundation, Alexander corrected coldly, which will be run by one of the most capable, hardworking people I've ever known. Elena happens to be living proof that single parents given proper support can achieve extraordinary things. This is insanity, Richard snarled. You're throwing away everything you've built for some woman and her brat. Alexander's fist hit the table so hard the water glasses jumped. Finish that sentence and you're fired. Not removed from the board, fired from every project and partnership Sterling Technologies has with your firm. I'll burn those bridges myself. Richard's face purpled, but he stayed silent. Third, Alexander continued, his voice returning to its measured tone, I'm restructuring my personal holdings. 51% control stays with me. The remaining shares will be split between a trust for my future children. He paused, letting that sink in, and an employee ownership program. The people who actually build this company will have a stake in its success. Future children? Margaret whispered. You're planning to marry her. I'm planning to build a life with people I love. Whether that includes marriage is between Elena and myself. Alexander looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. Here's what I know. For 10 years, I ran this company like a machine. I was efficient, ruthless, and profitable. I was also dying inside. I had a wife who left because I couldn't love her, a father I never knew, and a future as empty as my past. He pulled out Sophie's drawing, the one of the 3 stick figures under a rainbow, and placed it on the table. A 3-year-old drew this. She calls it our family. And she's right. Elena and Sophie are a distraction from my purpose. They are my purpose. Making Sophie smile, supporting Elena's dreams, building something that matters beyond market share. That's what gives meaning to everything else. You're choosing them over the company? Someone asked incredulously. I'm choosing to run a company that values what they represent. Compassion, loyalty, human connection. If that costs us some profits, so be it. If it makes our stock drop, I'll buy the shares myself. And if anyone in this room can't live with that direction. Alexander stood. There's the door. Nobody moved. I built Sterling Technologies from nothing, Alexander continued. I know every line of code in our original software. I've negotiated every major deal we've ever made. You all became wealthy because of my vision. Now my vision is evolving, and you have a choice. Evolve with me, or get left behind. And if we vote no confidence, Richard challenged, then I'll resign as CEO, sell my shares, and start over. I'll build a new company with new values and take every talented employee who's sick of this soulless culture with me. Alexander smiled slightly. Don't test me, Richard. You know I can do it. The question is whether you're willing to lose everything you've built here on principle. The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, one of the younger board members spoke up. My daughter is 3 years old. I've missed her last 2 birthdays for quarterly reviews. Maybe Mr. Sterling's approach isn't crazy. Maybe it's overdue. Another voice joined in. Our employee retention is terrible. We lose top talent to companies with better work-life balance. This could actually help us compete. One by one, the board members began to concede. Not all of them. Richard and 2 others remained stony-faced, but enough. Enough to give Alexander the mandate he needed. We'll vote on the restructuring next week, Alexander concluded. In the meantime, I'm taking the weekend off. Because it's Sophie's 4th birthday on Saturday, and I promised to help plan her party. That's non-negotiable. He walked out, leaving a folder on the table. Inside were detailed plans, financial projections, and case studies of companies that had successfully balanced profit with purpose. Alexander had done his homework. This wasn't sentiment, it was strategy informed by something he'd finally learned to value. Heart. When he arrived home, Elena was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She turned when he entered, worry in her eyes. How did it go? I told them the truth, Alexander said simply. That you and Sophie matter more to me than their approval. That I'm going to run my company differently from now on. And that if they don't like it, they can leave. Elena's hands flew to her mouth. Alexander, your career is meaningless without something worth working for. He crossed to her, taking her hands. Elena, I want to offer you a position. Not as my housekeeper, as executive director of a new foundation. $500 million in initial funding. Your mission would be to help single parents the way I wish someone had helped you. You'd have complete autonomy, a competitive salary, full benefits, and the resources to make a real difference. I don't understand. That's not a real job, that's the start of my apology for ever doubting you. For letting their poison into my head. For making Sophie cry. Alexander's voice roughened. You're brilliant, Elena. You've managed impossible situations with grace. You've raised an extraordinary child while working 3 jobs. Imagine what you could do with actual support. Tears streamed down Elena's face. Why are you doing this? Because I love you, Alexander said simply. Because Sophie was right, you both saved me. And because I want to build something that matters. Not just for us, but for every parent who's been where you were. Every child who deserves better than I can provide alone. Elena threw her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you. We deserve each other, Alexander corrected, holding her tight. We deserve the chance to build something beautiful together. A small cough interrupted them. Sophie stood in the doorway, eyes wide. Are you and Mama kissing? She asked with great interest. Alexander and Elena pulled apart, both blushing. They hadn't actually kissed yet, had been dancing around that inevitability. Not yet, Alexander said. I was waiting for permission from the most important person. Sophie's eyes went round. Me?
You.
Sophie, I love your mother. And I love you. I'd like to be part of your family, officially. But only if you're okay with that. Sophie was across the room in a heartbeat, launching herself at Alexander. He caught her, spinning her around as she giggled. Does this mean you'll be my daddy? She asked, suddenly shy. Alexander's heart clenched. If you want me to be. I always wanted a daddy. I asked Santa for one last Christmas, but Mama said Santa couldn't bring people. But you're already here. So maybe Santa knew and sent you early. Elena laughed through her tears. Maybe he did, baby. Can we have the birthday party here? Sophie asked excitedly. In the big house? I want to invite everyone from my old daycare and the nice lady at the bodega and the man who feeds the pigeons in the park. Alexander, who'd never hosted a child's birthday party, who'd specifically written no children into his event planning protocols, found himself saying, absolutely. We'll have the biggest, best birthday party this house has ever seen. With cake. 3 cakes. And balloons. So many balloons you'll float away. And can you wear a prince costume? Since you're the prince in my story. Alexander looked at Elena, who was trying not to laugh. I'll consider it. Please, Alex? Please, please, please? And that was how Alexander Sterling, billionaire CEO of Sterling Technologies, found himself searching online for adult prince costumes at midnight, while Elena laughed beside him and Sophie slept peacefully in the room down the hall. You know you're completely ridiculous, Elena said fondly. I know, Alexander agreed, clicking add to cart on a blue velvet cape. But I've spent 34 years being sensible. I think it's time I tried ridiculous. Elena kissed his cheek. I love ridiculous you. I love you too, Alexander said, turning to face her properly. Elena Morales, I love everything about you. Your strength, your compassion, the way you've fought for Sophie every day of her life. The way you sing in Spanish when you think nobody's listening. The way you see the best in people, even when they don't deserve it. Alexander. I know it's fast. I know we have 1,000 things to figure out. But I'm sure about this.
About us.
About building a life together. He took her hands. I'm not asking you to marry me, not yet. We need time. But I'm asking you to trust me. To believe that this is real. That I'm not going anywhere. I believe you, Elena whispered. I've believed you since you stayed with Sophie that first night, even though it terrified you. Since you learned to play Go Fish and read bedtime stories and let a 3-year-old teach you about love. They kissed then, finally, in the soft light of Alexander's study. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Elena was smiling. So, she said, about this birthday party. Alexander groaned. I've created a monster, haven't I? 2 monsters, Elena corrected. Sophie and I have big plans. As they planned together, laughing over ridiculous themes and arguing about cake flavors, Alexander felt something he'd never experienced before. Absolute contentment. Not the satisfaction of a successful deal or the rush of a market victory, but the simple joy of being exactly where he belonged. The storm wasn't over. Richard would push back, there would be challenges ahead, and Alexander knew building this new life wouldn't be easy. But with Elena beside him and Sophie sleeping down the hall, he finally understood what Sophie had tried to tell him all along. Love didn't make you weak. It made you brave enough to weather any storm. Saturday dawned bright and unseasonably warm for early January. Alexander woke to find Sophie already in his room. Their room, now, as the three of them had taken to falling asleep together more nights than not, with Sophie between them and Mr. Rabbit standing guard.
Alex.
It's my birthday. I'm 4 now. Sophie bounced on the bed. Did you forget? How could I forget? Alexander tickled her, eliciting shrieks of laughter. The most important day of the year? Elena appeared in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, wearing one of Alexander's shirts. She looked beautiful and perfect, and the sight still made his heart skip. Someone's excited, she observed, climbing onto the bed to join them. Mama, Alex, the party. Can we start decorating? I want to help. What followed was controlled chaos. The Sterling mansion had never seen anything like it. Alexander, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, clothing he'd had to purchase specifically for this occasion, helped hang streamers. Elena orchestrated the kitchen with Mrs. Chen, who'd softened considerably and now referred to Sophie as our little princess. Balloons multiplied like rabbits. A bouncy castle appeared in the backyard because Sophie had mentioned wanting one and Alexander had made it happen. At 2 p.m., guests began arriving. Not the usual Sterling crowd of CEOs and politicians, but Sophie's eclectic chosen family. Children from her old daycare, their worn-out parents, Mrs. Lopez from the bodega, who'd given Sophie free candy when Elena couldn't afford treats, Marcus, the homeless veteran who fed pigeons in the park and whom Sophie had befriended with her characteristic fearlessness, 3 of Elena's co-workers, and even Dr. Reeves, who'd been charmed by Sophie during her illness. Alexander, wearing the blue velvet cape Sophie had requested, greeted each guest personally. His staff watched in amazement as their normally frigid boss chatted with a homeless man about the best places to find breadcrumbs for birds, complimented a single mother's exhausted resilience, and helped a shy 5-year-old find the bathroom. Who are you, and what have you done with Alexander Sterling? His assistant Martha whispered to Elena. Elena just smiled. That is Alexander Sterling. He just forgot for a while. The party was magnificent. Children screamed in the bouncy castle. Sophie, wearing a princess dress that made her eyes glow, held court like visiting royalty. The 3 cakes were demolished. Games were played. And through it all, Alexander participated with genuine joy, his laughter ringing through the halls that had been silent for too long. As the afternoon wound down and parents began collecting their sugar-crashed children, Sophie tugged on Alexander's cape. I have to give you something, she said seriously. Wait here. She ran off, returning moments later with something clutched in her small fist. The other guests had gathered around, sensing something important. Remember the first time I saw you? Sophie asked. When Mama brought me here, and I was sick? Alexander knelt down to her level. I remember. You called me the prince. I knew you were sad. Your eyes were cold, and your castle was empty, even though it had lots of stuff in it. And I wanted to help, but I was too little and too sick. Sophie opened her hand. In it lay a single rose, slightly wilted now, but carefully preserved. The next day, when you read me a story, I found this rose in the garden. It was the only one still blooming in winter. Mama said it was special, that it was brave to bloom when everything else was cold. Alexander took the rose carefully, his throat tight. I kept it, Sophie continued, because I wanted to give it to you when you weren't sad anymore, when you remembered how to bloom. She looked up at him with those impossibly wise eyes. You're blooming now, Alex. You smile all the time. You play games and make jokes and love Mama and me. You're not the cold prince anymore. You're the prince who found his happy ending. Alexander pulled Sophie into his arms, unable to speak. This child, this tiny miracle, had seen him when he couldn't see himself, had held on to hope for him when he'd forgotten hope existed. Thank you, princess, he managed finally. This is the best gift I've ever received. Really? Better than all your computers and cars and stuff. Better than anything, Alexander confirmed. Because it reminds me of the most important day of my life. Your birthday?
No.
The day you gave me a rose when I'd forgotten how to bloom. Elena was crying openly now, as were several of the guests. Mrs. Lopez was translating quietly for Mrs. Chun, who dabbed at her eyes with her apron. I have something for you too, Alexander said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box, not a ring box, but something else. Sophie, this is a locket. Inside is a picture of you, your mama, and me from last week, when we went to the park. I want you to have it, so you always remember that you're loved, that you have a family, that you change someone's life just by being exactly who you are. Sophie opened the locket with trembling fingers, gasping at the tiny photograph inside. It's us. We're a family. We are, Alexander confirmed. Then he turned to Elena, who was watching with wonder in her eyes. From his other pocket, he pulled a different box. This one was ring-sized. The backyard went utterly silent. Elena, Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly in the hush. For months ago, you came to clean my house. I was cold, broken, convinced that caring about anything was weakness. I had everything except a reason to wake up in the morning. He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring. Not ostentatious, but clearly crafted with care. Then Sophie got sick and you both crashed into my life like a hurricane. You taught me that strength isn't about walls, it's about having the courage to let someone in. That love isn't a liability, it's what makes us human. That family isn't about blood, it's about choosing every day to show up for each other. Elena's hands covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. I know it's fast, Alexander continued. I know we're still learning each other, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Elena Morales, would you marry me? Would you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I can be worthy of you and Sophie? That I can be the man you both believed I could be? For a moment, Elena couldn't speak. Then Sophie tugged on her mother's dress. Say yes, Mama. You have to say yes. Then we'll be a real family forever and ever. Elena laughed through her sobs. Yes, she managed. Yes, Alexander. 1,000 times yes. The backyard erupted in cheers and applause. Alexander slipped the ring onto Elena's finger and kissed her while Sophie jumped between them, squealing with delight. We're getting married. Alex is going to be my daddy forever. As the celebration continued around them, Mrs. Lopez breaking out into Spanish songs, the children running wild, Dr. Reeves popping champagne, Alexander held Elena close, Sophie wedged happily between them. I love you, he whispered into Elena's hair. Both of you. More than I knew it was possible to love anything. We love you too, Elena whispered back. Our prince who learned to bloom. That evening, after the last guests had departed and Sophie had finally crashed from sugar and excitement, Alexander and Elena sat on the back terrace, watching the stars emerge. Sophie was asleep inside, her new locket clutched in one hand, Mr. Rabbit in the other. I keep expecting to wake up, Elena admitted, leaning against Alexander's shoulder. This all feels too perfect to be real. It's real, Alexander assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. Messy and complicated and absolutely real. We'll have challenges ahead. The board, the media, figuring out how to blend our lives. But we'll face them together. Together, Elena agreed. She looked down at her ring, then up at the stars. You know what Sophie told me yesterday? What? She said that before we came to live here, she used to wish on stars for a daddy. Not just any daddy, but one who would love us exactly right. One who needed us as much as we needed him. Elena's voice cracked. She said God must have been listening really carefully to send us the perfect one. Alexander swallowed hard. I'm not perfect. No, Elena agreed. But you're perfect for us. And that's all that matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the winter stars will overhead. Finally, Alexander spoke again. I've been thinking about the foundation, about what to call it. Oh, I want to call it Sophie's Rose. Because she gave me a rose when everything in my life was winter, and somehow that one small gesture started everything blooming again. He turned to face Elena. Every parent we help, every child we give a better future, it all starts with what Sophie taught me. That small acts of kindness, given at exactly the right moment, can change everything. Elena wiped fresh tears. She'd love that. Teaching other people how to bloom. Just like she taught me. Inside, they heard Sophie stirring. Mama? Alex? Where are you? We're here, princess. Alexander called. Sophie appeared in her pajamas, dragging Mr. Rabbit. I had a dream, she announced, climbing into Alexander's lap. We were all in a castle, but it wasn't cold anymore. It was warm and full of flowers, and there were other people there too. Lots of mommies and daddies and kids. And everyone was happy. That sounds like a beautiful dream, Elena said softly. It wasn't a dream. Sophie insisted with a certainty only a 4-year-old can muster. It was a real dream. The kind that comes true if you believe hard enough and love big enough. Alexander held Sophie close, looking at Elena over their daughter's head. Yes, their daughter, because that's what she would become officially once the adoption papers went through. He thought about the foundation they would build, the lives they would change, the family they would create. You know what, princess, he said. I think you're absolutely right. It's not just a dream. It's a promise. And I intend to keep it. Sophie yawned, nestled against his chest. Good. 'Cause princes always keep their promises. That's how fairy tales work. As the three of them sat together under the stars, Alexander thought about the journey that had brought him here. The cold, broken man he'd been. The walls he'd built. The life he'd thought was success, but was really just survival. Then he thought about a little girl with a rose, seeing past his defenses to the heart he'd forgotten he possessed. About her mother, who'd shown him that strength and softness weren't opposites but partners. About how the smallest gesture, a child's gift, freely given, had cracked open his carefully frozen world and let the light back in. In his pocket, carefully preserved, he carried the rose Sophie had given him. Slightly wilted now, but precious beyond measure. A reminder that winter doesn't last forever. That even in the coldest seasons, brave blooms can push through. That sometimes it takes a child's innocent faith to show you that happy endings aren't just for fairy tales. They're for anyone brave enough to let love in. Alex. Sophie murmured, half asleep. Yes, princess. Thank you for being my prince. The one who learned to bloom. Alexander kissed the top of her head, his heart so full it might burst. Thank you for being the rose that changed everything. And under the winter stars, surrounded by the two people who'd saved him from himself, Alexander Sterling finally understood what it meant to be truly wealthy. Not in money or power or things, but in love, in family, in the courage to bloom. Years later, the Sophie's Rose Foundation would help thousands of single parents build better lives for their children. But none of them would ever know the real story, how it all started with a 3-year-old girl, a worn stuffed rabbit, and one perfectly timed rose, given to a man who'd forgotten how gardens grow. How sometimes the smallest hands plant the deepest roots. How love, once bloomed, transforms everything it touches. How every fairy tale's happy ending is really just a new beginning in disguise.